Honourable Member for Bass, Ms Finlay.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I rise this afternoon to give my contribution on the report back for the Honourable Nick Street, in particular as Minister for Sport and Recreation, but also for his responsibilities under the Minister for Local Government. Had the opportunity to sit in with our Deputy Leader, Anita Dow, for a period of the scrutiny and hear the exchanges around the reform process recommended for local government. And I did note with interest the exchange in response to questions, particularly around what had the government particularly identified as the reason to brief out a process to look at reform, and what was the problem they were seeking to solve. Because it feels like since the initial time where it was suggested that this process would commence, that there's been a lot of movement in terms of expectations, and I think that creates a little bit of uncertainty in community, either in the actual communities but also in the local government community. It was interesting to note exchanges across the table, questions around what will change. There was reference to a quote where the Minister suggested that had been misrepresented in the quote, but an exchange around the impacts on rates in the local communities and whether they would actually decrease as a result, as a benefit to local communities. And I, from memory, remember the exchange on one of the local radio programs where the rates, wouldn't go down. And so you question the benefit to communities of that. There was a lot of exchange across the table about the services and the importance of particularly unique services where local government are often called on to fill the gaps from services not delivered by either the Commonwealth or the state government, and how particularly small communities would be impacted by the potential removal of these services. But an assurance was provided that it was not the intention of this reform process to remove services from local communities. So again, with that status quo remaining. And the other issue that was interesting to observe and hear about was the impact of the local jobs in local communities. And other people I know there was a question in question time this morning about that, but particularly again for smaller communities, the jobs in those communities and the families associated with those jobs are critical to supporting and sustaining those local communities. So it appeared through questioning and through the evolution of this process that there's not a clear problem being solved and there's not a clear brief on what is intended to occur and the benefits that are intended to be applied to local communities. And with the delays on the delivery of these reports coming through, it is interesting to note that the can has been potentially kicked down the road beyond what might be a term of this government, for instance. An area of particular concern and interest for me is the Minister's responsibility under sport and recreation. In the report back, a number of areas were discussed in this area, particularly around the stadium proposal, AFL, the provision of the advice around the AFL stadium and the team, but also then about other local sporting infrastructure, multi-purpose indoor sporting facilities. So just reflecting quickly on the deep concerns that are being held in the community but also in this House around the integrity of decision-making and disclosure of advice, inclusion of elements of the deal, what is included in the deal that will burden Tasmanians. There's still a lot of unanswered questions. You would think when a parliament goes through a process of delivering a budget and having budget scrutiny in the estimates process, with all of those questions and answers, and also questions and answers in the parliament, that by this stage there would be absolute clarity around all elements of what Tasmanians are being asked to carry on behalf of the decisions of this government. But in fact it feels like there's no clarity and also a lack of trust in terms of what that process will end up feeling like for Tasmanians who now in a current cost of living crisis are already burdened by financial pressures and are being expected to have additional financial burdens held by this government in terms of the costs of what is likely to be a significant amount of money from this government. As recently as today, the Premier standing and saying they've got no idea about the designs for this proposal and therefore could have no idea about the costs. So despite budget and scrutiny on this, still so many unanswered questions. We regularly express our concern about the priorities of this government, and an area where we feel that there's a really strong mismatch in terms of the expectations and needs of our community and the deliverables by this government is about the grassroots local community infrastructure for sports. There's a lot of conversation that says that we invest in stadia and that supports grassroots and pathways. We know that a team brings those benefits to Tasmania, but a government that doesn't keep or take their eye off the ball of local facilities is a government that is actually really genuinely supporting local communities. In our Deputy Speaker electorate of Bass, and I know that the Deputy Speaker has been particularly interested in this as well, there is one sport that is really being a bit of a vocal voice for other sports, not only in Launceston but across Tasmania, and not only for basketball in this instance but lots of other sports as well, that there's a deep concern about the quality of compliant court provision in Launceston for basketball. And just using that as an example, there is a well-founded shortage of basketball courts in Launceston. Many times ago, and the Deputy Speaker and myself have both been members of the Launceston City Council and are intimately aware of how long there has been court shortages in Launceston. And it appears that a method of this government to satisfy people is to make comments or statements or commitments with very little follow-up. So there had been an expectation in the local basketball community that there would be commitments around indoor sporting facilities. There had been a sort of taking them along on a path of a story that would occur. Despite that, I know that there's a number of petitions circulating in the community, one at a federal level, one at a state level, with the local community expressing their passion and their desire for increased courts and not seeking the gold standard outcome but a moderate outcome in terms of the continued investment in courts. And unfortunately, at a recent announcement where in the northern suburbs of Launceston there's a multi-court hub being developed, despite suggesting, and there has been, initially it was a moderate suggestion that there might have been 3 courts for basketball included in that, it had elevated to an indication that there might have been 8 or 9 courts within that facility for basketball. The concern with basketball facilities in Launceston is that many of the courts are not compliant. And not having compliant courts actually impacts the ability of an athlete, either a junior or a developing or an emerging athlete, to actually develop the appropriate skills to have the best possible chance of success in their sport. And even the courts that have been announced in the northern suburbs hub, and I'm not sure if the Deputy Speaker is aware of this, are non-compliant. There have been courts for netball developed with the right timber surfaces with sprung floors that are appropriate, particularly for juniors that are developing in their skeletal systems, to be able to use that appropriately. But my understanding is that rubber-based floors on concrete bases are proposed for basketball, and that's non-compliant. So Launceston Basketball continue to have the provision and the delivery of non-compliant assets to a sport that has, as recently as this month, been identified in a regional facilities report, a current shortage of courts, of around 15 courts in Launceston, and by 2036 a shortage, if there's no growth in the sport, and it's one of the fastest growing sports not only in Tasmania but particularly in Launceston, and then we'll have a shortage of 17 courts. It's going backwards. The local community are asking for timeframes and commitments financially for courts to be delivered. We know that there was proposed to have courts compliant in the Northern Suburbs Hub. Unless the designs and the specifications for that change, they are not compliant. We know that in the future there's proposed to be a third stage of York Park redevelopment. There would be 3 courts or a show court potentially be able to be included with that, but the current facility at the Elfin Sports Centre, which is not a home of basketball, that they don't have open access to, that they are often sent off court for other activities in that space. The number of courts there that haven't really had significant investment in the past 30 years needs significant upgrade. So for this government to continue to be obsessed with $1 billion plus stadium in Hobart when there are 2 stadium infrastructure in Tasmania already, and to do that at the detriment of other sports right across Tasmania, across a full range of sports and a full range of communities, just shows how far this government are from having their priorities right for Tasmania.